Voilà.
I'm going to ask that everyone please mute themselves except for the person who is speaking. This is a committee meeting. It is open to the public, but there is no public comment session. That doesn't necessarily mean that we won't take questions, but I just want to make sure that everyone has muted themselves. I'm going to drop the agenda into the chat just so you all have it. You've probably already seen it. And with that, I'd like to start the meeting for tonight, January 10th at 6:33 for the minutes. Hi, everyone. My name is Evie Hansopoulos, and I am the chair of the Housing Committee and a member of Community Board 1. Thank you so much for being here. And I'd like to wish everyone a happy new year before we get started. We have a wonderful guest speaker here this evening. I'm really excited to welcome back Samuel Stein, who spoke to us probably about 3 years ago, I think, right when I became chair of the Housing Committee. And Sam at the time was a grad student at the CUNY Grad Center working on his dissertation. I'm going to let you kind of fill in, just kind of where you are with that. But Sam now works for the Community Service Society, which is a very well-established nonprofit that focuses a lot on issues related to poverty, including housing. So we're really thrilled that you're here today. He has written a report that he is going to share with us, some of the highlights, and also talk us through a new tool that they've developed at the Community Service Society to really help people get the kind of information that they need about housing issues and data. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Sam. You can just maybe say a little bit more about yourself. And we'll make sure that you have the capacity to share your screen because I know that you have a presentation. But once again, thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing your expertise. It was really helpful last time, and I learned a lot. And I think the other board members and the people who were attending did as well. So thrilled to have you here again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evie. Thanks for inviting me back. It's nice to see you all. My name is Sam Stein. As Evie said, I came last time as a PhD student in geography at the City University of New York. I graduated, I guess, a couple years ago now, and I'm working as a housing policy analyst at the Community Service Society, working on issues of affordability, of ending homelessness, rent regulation, eviction protection, and more. And so Evie asked if I could speak about zoning and land use issues, and I thought that might be a good opportunity to present a report that I wrote for the Community Service Society. I'll put the link to it in the chat if anybody wants to read the full report. But I'm going to give an overview now, which assessed de Blasio's legacy on housing over the last 8 years. And the report is about a year old, so it's the first 7 years, but that kind of lets us look at everything up until the pandemic, since a lot changed in the last year due to the pandemic, due to the federal interventions and state interventions around housing. So that kind of was a neat end mark for the comparisons that we were doing from before and after. And the title of the report is Assessing de Blasio's Housing Legacy. Why hasn't the most affordable housing program, the most ambitious affordable housing program, produced a more affordable city? And from that title, I think you get an idea of where we're coming from. We really do find that de Blasio's program was ambitious in terms of the amount of money spent, the amount of initiatives done, and yet there are still many of the same housing dynamics that we had before his mayoralty plaguing us today. So the point of this report and of presenting it today isn't to be mired in the past, but more to understand what happened over the next 8 years so we can have an understanding of what we'll need going forward. So to start, we talk about how housing affordability was already a major crisis when the pandemic and recession hit. So we understand that things got pretty bad on the housing front with so many people losing their jobs and unable to pay rent. But we felt it was important to show that this was really already the case for low-income New Yorkers. So every year, our organization, the Community Service Society, conducts a poll of New Yorkers, and we look especially at low-income New Yorkers. We oversample low-income New Yorkers so we can get really into detail about what they're experiencing. And this is the longest running annual poll of low-income New Yorkers in existence. So we're on year 19 now. Anyway, this is data from 2019, the year before the pandemic. And we found that among low-income New Yorkers, about 30% had fallen behind on rent, 20% had their utilities shut off, and almost the same number had had to move in with other people over the course of the past year. 15% were threatened with eviction. Those are really high numbers, and numbers that became sort of more generalized out from the low-income population to people at middle incomes during the pandemic. The point of this slide is to show that in 2019, low-income New Yorkers were already experiencing a pretty severe housing crisis.
Sam, we're not seeing the slides yet. You have to do a share screen, please.
That is a good point. It's been 2 years and I'm still not totally with it on Zoom.
Don't worry, thank you.
Can you see now?
Excellent, perfect.
Okay, so this was the first slide of low-income experiences of housing hardships in 2019 in New York City. So as he promised in his campaign, the de Blasio administration achieved record levels of affordable housing investment and production. This really is the case if you compare the de Blasio years to the Bloomberg years, Giuliani years, Dinkin years, even the Koch years, which were known for their investments in housing. This is true in terms of both dollars spent and units produced. We should say, though, that housing production is a bit of a euphemism. It means both construction of new affordable housing, but also preservation of affordable housing that would otherwise become unaffordable. It's kind of two things in one. And this chart shows how much affordable housing was preserved and how much was built, broken down by income groups. I think this crowd knows these terms, but just in case, AMI stands for Area Median Income. It's the average household income for New York City plus several connected counties. And as my predecessor at the Community Service Society, Tom Waters, always like to point out, it's actually not even that. It's then added a little bit more to account for high construction costs in New York City. So 100% of AMI is not the actual average household income in New York City. The average household income is closer to 60% AMI. And in any case, this slide breaks down what was produced in the first 7 years of the de Blasio administration by income bracket. And you'll see that the biggest chunk goes to people who are described as low income, 50 to 80% of the area median income. In actuality, that's about the average for New York City, a little bit lower, a little bit higher in some areas, but that's where most of the housing went. Less on the higher end, which from our perspective is appropriate, but also less on the lower end, extremely low income and very low income populations. As we see in this slide, though, this was not necessarily the populations that had the greatest housing need. So this data was actually compiled by the former controller, by Scott Stringer's office for a report released in 2018, where they compared the metric of housing need, which was households who are rent burdened or paying more than they can afford in rent, or doubled up with another household, so overcrowded. And then it broke it down by these income brackets, the same ones we saw in the last slide, and compared that to how many housing units were supposed to be produced by Housing New York, the de Blasio administration's primary housing plan. And what the controller's report found was that the de Blasio administration was essentially overshooting for low-income, moderate-income, and middle-income households, and underproducing for very low incomes, and especially for extremely low incomes. And this goes to explain some of why homelessness did not really change, and in fact got worse for these 7 years under the de Blasio administration. There were a lot of very and extremely low-income people who became homeless, and there was not a lot of new housing being produced specifically for them. We also looked at the geography of affordable housing production to see where these housing units are being produced, where they're being built, and where they're being preserved. And we found that, as has been true for previous administrations, the largest placement of affordable housing has been in the Bronx, which is the poorest borough in New York City. Next came Manhattan and Brooklyn, for what together would be a majority of the affordable housing. And then relatively little was built in Queens and almost nothing in Staten Island. So Queens saw 15,699 units, which on its own can maybe seem like a lot, but if you're looking at a total, it's only 9.5%. We looked also at one important statistic, which is rent burdens in New York City. A household is considered rent burden in the US today when they pay more than 30% of their income on housing. It's important to note that that's a moving target. In past years, it was 25%, and before that, it was 20%. But at this point, the federal government determines that you're rent burdened or paying too much in housing if you pay more than 30% of your income. We looked year to year from 2014 to 2019, so the de Blasio years before the pandemic, at overall rent burdens. So looking at the city's rental population as a whole. And we found that the rent burden did go down from 2014 to 2019, or rather the percentage of tenants who are rent burdened or paying too much in housing. So in 2014, 46.3% of New York renters were rent burdened, and by 2019, it was 40.9%. That's still pretty high, but at least it's movement in the right direction. We then broke out low-income tenants, people making less than 200% of the federal poverty line, which is about 80% AMI and below. And we found that for them, a very large proportion are rent burdened, and that number barely nudged basically a statistically insignificant change from 2014 to 2019. In 2014, 72.3% of low-income New Yorkers were rent burdened. In 2019, 71.5%, so barely any change. So what this means is that while the city did become slightly more affordable, it became more affordable to people who are making more money. That's not exactly the kind of change that the city needed to solve its long-term affordable housing crisis. One area where we did find a real significant change under the de Blasio administration was in the Rent Guidelines Board. The Rent Guidelines Board is one thing that the mayor controls entirely. All of its members are appointed by the mayor. There's no city council check on that. There's no seats for the borough president or the public advocate like there is on, say, the City Planning Commission. This is a strictly mayorally controlled board. And again, I think the folks on this call know this, but just in case, what the Rent Guidelines Board does is look at data about housing costs to tenants and housing costs to landlords over the past year, but also over the preceding years, and determine how the rent will change for rent stabilized tenants, as well as tenants in SROs and certain other kinds of housing types. SRO is single room occupancy rental housing. Under the de Blasio administration, we saw historically lower increases for rent stabilized tenants than under either the Giuliani administration or the Bloomberg administration, including most notably 2.5 years really of rent freezes spread out through the de Blasio tenancy. And this had a tremendous effect on tenant savings. over those years, and was one of the more effective things that de Blasio did in terms of limiting rent increases for low-income tenants. Of course, rent stabilization is not a means-tested program. You don't have to show that you're low income to get into rent-stabilized housing, but it is the single largest stock of housing for rent for low-income New Yorkers. Even more low-income New Yorkers live in rent-stabilized housing than in public housing. In this report, we also looked at rezonings, and we made what is, by now a pretty familiar judgment on the first round of rezonings. This was before Gowanus or Soho were completed. And we found that in all of the areas that were rezoned by the city, so rezonings that were initiated by the Department of City Planning, the demographics had one thing in common, which is that they were majority people of color, and that the average income was below the city's average. So what these rezonings were about was increasing the development capacity in these neighborhoods. And after mandatory inclusionary housing was passed, all new developments in areas that had been upzoned would have to have some degree of affordable housing. This was the subject of my talk a couple years ago when I came by, showing that a lot of the affordable housing was not necessarily affordable to people who live in that neighborhood or people like them who might move in. It often was more expensive than what was there, and that was certainly the case in all 6 of these initial rezonings. It's not the case in the last 2. We also looked at a less familiar metric, though, than Department of City Planning rezonings, which is privately initiated rezonings. Rezonings that are made at the request of a landowner and a developer. And we were wondering, did these have any better a record of producing locally affordable housing that would be affordable to average members of these communities? And what we found was that the answer was not really. This is a map that shows where most of the privately initiated rezonings were. So that's the size of the black dot. If it's a bigger size, then there were more rezonings. If it's a smaller size, there were less. And then the shading below shows what percent of the affordable units that were created through these MIH actions would be affordable without an extra subsidy, like a Section 8 voucher, to the average tenant in that, or the average household in that community district. And the more red it is, the less affordable the affordable housing is. The more white it is, the more affordable it is. So you see Queens Community District 1 did relatively well on that front with, I believe, 60 to 80% of the affordable units being locally affordable. So that's good on those terms, though we should remember that all of the rest of the housing is not going to be affordable locally. But you can compare that to, for example, the Bronx, the entire borough of the Bronx. None of the affordable housing that was produced through private MIH actions was affordable to tenants in those districts. The same goes in East Harlem, in Staten Island, and in Eastern Queens and Brooklyn, several other neighborhoods as well, including the areas surrounding Community District 1 in Queens. The final slide I'm going to share from this report looked at long-term trends from our annual survey of low-income New Yorkers in housing hardships. So we ask about all sorts of hardships, including housing hardships, and these can include the heat going out, it can include mold, it can include a threat of eviction. All of these things count as housing hardships. And we broke it down over the years for a long term from 2002 to 2017 by public housing, NYCHA, by subsidized housing, or housing that is usually privately owned but has government subsidy for affordable housing, and private housing, which would include both market rate and rent stabilized. And we found that there was positive movement in the private housing stock, with the percentage of low-income households in private housing experiencing 4 or more housing deficiencies going down in the private stock from, I think it's 10% to 4% of tenants. So that's great. In the subsidized housing stock, it remains about the same, from 10% down to 9%. But in public housing, it went up significantly, from 11% to 21%. So to repeat, that's 11% of low-income households reporting 4 or more housing deficiencies in 2002, all the way up to 21%, or more than 1 in 5 in 2017. I got the source wrong on this. I'm sorry, this was not our survey. This is the city survey. This is the housing and vacancy survey, which surveys far more people than we are able to. So this shows that while there were some improvements in housing conditions, especially in the private housing stock, things really got worse in public housing as a result of long-term federal disinvestment, but also local mismanagement. And we've seen a number of scandals around bad conditions ranging from lead to mold to a trash compactor fire just a couple weeks ago that really need to be seriously addressed and not just left to the next administration. So that's an overview of the data that's in the report. I shared the link to the full report earlier on in the presentation, and I'll be happy to share that again. And I'd be happy to take questions as well, but I want to show one other thing before I turn it over to questions. And this is a new tool that the Community Service Society has just released. I'm going to put the link to this in the chat as well. And this is a public data tool. We call it a dashboard, New York's rental housing dashboard, that allows users to look up all sorts of information about housing, but especially rental housing by different geographies. And so if you click on a housing map, you'll get a map of all of New York State, and you can look at the information by state Senate district, by state assembly district, congressional district, city council district, or perhaps most of interest to this group, by community district. When nothing is clicked, you see some data for the entire city. This is the distribution of renters' incomes from 0 to 25%, all the way up to 150%. And this is the distribution of rents, so how much people are paying in rent, broken out in $500 increments. But you can click on one particular district. The data at the bottom readjusts, so you see the local rental income distribution and local rent distribution. And then there's a whole array of different metrics that you can look up. You can look and see how many housing units are there in this particular district, and you'll see 73,301. You can look at median rental household income. How much money does the average renter make? Oops, I'm sorry, that available isn't available at the community district level. I apologize. Percent renter occupied within the district. Here is very high, 79.6%. And there's a link to a fact sheet that lays out all of these data for every community board, and it'll take you specifically to the one for your district. You can also look at this data as charts. Click on community district, unclick the ones that are checked initially, and check Queens 1. And you will see this as a chart, which is sometimes easier to read. Tenure between owners and renters. How many folks are rent burdened? So 24% of Community District 1 residents are rent burdened, or paying 30 to 50% of their income in rent, but a whole 21% are severely rent burdened, paying more than 50% of their income in rent. You can see the rental breakdown by race as well, and other data. So I shared this link in the fact sheet, but it's a great tool to see some rental data for your district. We're going to try to update it every year. You can also compare, so you can look at a couple different ones at once and see, between Queens 1 and Queens 2, how does the breakdown differ? And if you look back at the map, you can similarly instead of choosing one district, you can choose a metric, and then you can see how your district compares to any others by that metric. You can look at number of public housing units. You can look at rent burden and see how your district compares to others. So I hope this has all been useful, both the presentation about de Blasio's housing legacy and the data tool, and I am happy to take any questions folks might have.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. That tool is amazing. I can't wait to kind of delve into it later, but thank you for sharing that, and also just for the general overview of your report that you did, and I hope that everybody has the opportunity to go read it, because there's a lot of really great information there. It goes in much more depth. So thank you for that. I'd like to, maybe I'll start with a couple of questions, and then if other board members have questions as well, what you could do if you're a board member and you have a question, please just put your name in the chat so that I'll know in what order to call on people. And then, you know, it is a committee meeting, and usually the observers don't ask questions, but this is a great opportunity, I think, for you to ask Sam questions. And so definitely I want to allow people who are here as public participants to have the opportunity as well. So let's start. I'll start with just a couple questions. You had mentioned that Queens had almost about 16,000 affordable housing units built under the de Blasio administration in Queens, which was about 9.5%. So I'm just wondering, how many were lost? Like, is that a net number? Is that a gross number? Because often what happens is when developments go up, you know, things get torn down, and sometimes those are kind of the de facto affordable housing units. They're not necessarily rent stabilized, but they might be, a 3-family home, that had lower rents than kind of what the market rate was. So I'm curious if that's a net number or if that's a gross number, and if you know that answer.
Great question. That is a gross number. So these are the numbers that the city gives us. They post data usually on a monthly or bi-monthly basis about the housing activity that they've done. The first thing to note is that unit number 15,699 is both construction and preservation. Construction is, what it sounds like, building new affordable housing. In the case of a rezoning, that might involve a tear down, but in the case of new nonprofit affordable housing, it's almost certainly happening on either a vacant lot or a lot that didn't have housing before. It's extremely rare for privately owned housing to be torn down to build nonprofit housing without eminent domain, which the city hasn't done for the purpose of building affordable housing for some time. So preservation, on the other hand, has to do with expiring subsidies. So that could be a project-based Section 8 building where the developer got a 30-year subsidy to make the housing affordable, and year 30 comes up and the city basically resubsidizes the housing through a capital grant or a low interest loan or something else, and it stays affordable. So there is preservation that's counted in these numbers, but there isn't the preservation of the kind of housing you're talking about, which is either rent stabilized housing or housing where the landlord just happened to charge less than the market rate because they were socially responsible, because they knew the household that was renting for them, or for any other reason. And so we don't then have those net numbers. The biggest source of loss of affordable housing was, for a long time, vacancy decontrol, which was when housing units, apartments, could go out of rent stabilization after their rents surpassed a certain threshold and they became vacant. That became illegal in the 2019 Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. And so we expect to see less of a loss of that kind of affordable housing going forward, but that's too recent for us to see the results immediately. But that's a very important question, and people should always keep in mind, what is being lost as compared to what's being added.
Great, thank you. Okay, Doreen, I'm going to go to the board members. Doreen, you are first for your question to Sam.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to ask about a little bit more about like these rezoning things, like, the story of recently the Hoyt Avenue, 31st Street was like that. The rezoning is going to happen, and we see a lot of these problematic developments occurring that are yielding gentrification. And if it's affordable housing, it's not even really deeply affordable, et cetera. Like, what can actually be done, especially in this Adams administration, and even with progressives seeming to support development, to actually make sure New York was affordable for the most neediest and vulnerable, because that's an issue that's only been getting worse. And I'm sort of at a loss personally about that.
Well, it's hard to do on a one community district level. So the Adams administration could revise the terms of mandatory inclusionary housing. They could make the mandatory affordable housing more affordable, or they could perhaps have a local metric so that the housing should be X% lower than the average median rent in that district, or something like that, so that you couldn't have this absurd situation where the so-called affordable housing rents for more than market rate housing in the neighborhood. We don't know exactly what the Adams administration's take on these things are going to be. He has signaled that he's interested in upzoning more of Manhattan. We'll see if he really is, or if he pulls that off, if he wants to, rather than the kind of neighborhoods that have been the targets for city planning initiated rezonings under de Blasio. But I think if your concern is the affordable housing that's being produced is not affordable to us, it's really important for community boards to come out and say that that's their critique, and what they want is more deeply affordable housing. Because I think the assumption that comes to people's minds is that community boards don't like low-income housing, they don't like affordable housing, and that's why they oppose these rezonings. If that's not the case for you, I want you all to be loud and clear about that. That the reason that you don't like it is because these units aren't affordable to the people you care about, and you want more deeply affordable housing. And don't let them get away with claiming that what you're really against is truly affordable housing.
I think that was probably like the best advice that you gave us when you came and spoke last time, Sam. And I think it really helped us as a board and as a committee to ask for more details, because I think, we would often hear this is going to be affordable housing, but we didn't actually really kind of drill down into what that meant, what it looked like, what are the income bands, what is the AMI, which is it option 1, option 2. And I think that really kind of helped us push for more of that, so that like option 2 is not going to serve community board 1. We really want to push for more and more of the deeply affordable, because 25% is the so-called affordable. The other 75 is all market rate. So already there's a huge imbalance there, right? And then that's just kind of coupled with the fact that the MIH affordable housing is out of reach for a lot of the people who really need it and who actually live in this community and want to stay in this community. So thank you for that. And good question, Doreen. Okay, Katie, gonna go to you right now.
Great, thank you so much. I have a question. You mentioned that, maybe I misunderstood or misheard, that renters were surveyed. Is that correct?
So I think I mentioned 2 surveys. One is done by the Community Service Society every year, called the Unheard Third Survey. The other is done by the City of New York every 3 or 4 years, and that's called the Housing and Vacancy Survey. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I guess my question has to do, besides just the affordability, I think also something that I'm a renter and I've been a lifelong renter, is the quality of the housing. So even if it's affordable, it doesn't mean it's the healthiest living conditions. And I think that's also another problem that isn't addressed with a lot of the initiatives, is that just because your housing is affordable, so-called affordable, doesn't mean it's the best kept building, the safest conditions for an apartment. And I'm wondering if that's part of these surveys. And I would love at least, Evie, for our committee to kind of, even if it's an informal survey, to figure out, how people feel in this community. I'm personally, my household is going through a lead abatement right now. So there's a lot going on, especially with older construction smaller landlords. It's not always easy for them, but sometimes people, just for the sake of having cheap rent, live in conditions that they wouldn't normally put up with. So I'm wondering how this work, or the city's work and these surveys and the work you're doing, may shed more light on that.
Yeah, I was about to say that the last thing that you said, that one of the reasons that this is so pernicious is that people will stay in dangerous or unhealthy conditions because it's affordable, and because there's not a better option for them to move into, which is also an argument for the production of more affordable housing so that people can get out of bad situations when they're in them. But in terms of our surveys, yes, our Unheard Third survey asks about conditions, but the housing and vacancy survey does as well. Ours has the benefit of being annual. Theirs has the much greater benefit of being a far wider survey. And because of our sample size, basically we can't go down to the sub-borough area, but the housing and vacancy survey absolutely can. You can go to the zip code or lower. And I bet you could get someone from HPD's unit that does this survey to give you a rundown of some of those conditions, because they also ask questions about conditions as well as affordability, as well as how many people are living there and overcrowding. And they have really interesting over time analyses. So you can see, are things getting better or worse for this population? I think they conducted the survey, maybe it was last summer. It was late this year, not only because of the pandemic, but also because they don't like to do it the same year as the US Census, so that people don't get confused having two census people knocking on their door and asking them questions. So it'll be out later this year, 2022.
Thank you,
The
Sam.
last one we have is from 2017, and I bet HPD would be able to give you a good presentation about its findings.
Evie, I'm sorry can I ask one more question?
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
I have a question. Sam, you mentioned how we have to use our voices and say how we want more affordable housing, and the need for it is great in our community for individuals and for families, for current residents and for future residents who are trying to think broadly. But even though the board does do that, sometimes it just feels like it doesn't matter. So like it's expressed thoughtfully, how we're not NIMBYs. We just want to make sure that the housing is truly affordable for the current population of people that live here. And it doesn't seem to matter sometimes. And these things just go ahead.
Yeah, I certainly understand that frustration. And I know that the community board has the unenviable position of being the first in line in the Euler process, but not having a binding vote. But I would encourage you to keep your voices loud on that front, especially with a new city council, a new mayoral administration, even a new governor. There's maybe a new audience to hear that line. And also there's a new audience to misinterpret your actions. You want to be really clear about, about your desire to have new development be locally affordable. Not for there not to be new development, and also not for there to be a whole rash of development that's not affordable to people in your neighborhood. What you want is development that is affordable to the people who need housing in your neighborhood.
Thank you. Dom, I see your hand is up. But before we get to you, Sam, I just wanted to kind of follow up on Katie's first question, or just her point about the conditions of housing. Could you go back to your last slide? Because I think you kind of talked about how many deficiencies were reported in each category of housing. And my question is, I know that it went down for the private homes. It kind of went way up for NYCHA, right? Which I think we're all, well, not everybody, but hopefully people are becoming more and more aware of that. But also for the subsidized housing, you said it kind of stayed flat. So that's housing that we're kind of funding with our tax dollars. Like, are there any repercussions for that? Like for the developers who are building this housing and then it's, inadequate, right? Or they're getting subsidies for this affordable housing and they're not actually maintaining it in the way that they need to.
Yeah, I think there can be penalties, but we need real enforcement for it. So these are self-reported hardships or deficiencies. These are the tenants reporting that they have a problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Department of Buildings or HPD or HUD, depending, or HCR, depends who's subsidizing the housing, has come in to check on it. There's often a better record of checking for deficiencies when a tenant moves in than after they've been there for a while. So one of the good things about the Section 8 program is that it requires an inspection before the tenant can move in to make sure that our tax dollars are subsidizing a good and habitable apartment. It doesn't necessarily check to make sure that's still the case 10 years later. And so I think you could be making the case, you know, just by these numbers not getting much better, that we need to do better in terms of enforcement.
Great, thank you. Okay, Dominic?
You closed the screen share the minute, just as I was unmuting. Hi, everybody. Hi, Sam. I have a few points, not necessarily in any order. You just hit on Section 8. So my first question, that's Cheddar, would be, it's our impression Section 8 is discontinued, or, you know, not still, do you want to answer that, or, and I'll, okay.
Sure, yeah. So Section 8 isn't discontinued. We just need a lot more of it. So there's two kinds of Section 8. There's project-based Section 8, where the developer gets the subsidy and has to rent at below market rents. And then there's a voucher-based Section 8, where the tenant has a voucher and then they use that to pay what they can afford and the government covers the rest. There are enough vouchers out there to cover about a quarter of the people who need it. So occasionally the federal government produces a bunch of new vouchers. They did that in one of the COVID stimulus acts, I forget which one. And they sent New York, I think it was 7,000 new vouchers. That's great, but we need a whole lot more than that for a city of, you know, close to 9 million. So there was a bill that was introduced to Congress this year by Congressmember Richie Torres from the Bronx that would ramp up the number of vouchers until everybody who qualified for it got it. That bill, you know, hasn't moved. The Build Back Better bill would, I think, about double the number of vouchers. That would bring us from, you know, a quarter of the population who needs it getting it to half the population who needs it getting it. It'd still be a huge increase, but not what we need. In any case, it's not discontinued, but it is underfunded.
How many does New York City have now, Section 8? Like
I
7,000
don't
more
know.
on top of,
Sorry.
I wonder if that 7,000 was insignificant.
Well, it's not, I mean, it's not insignificant. Most of it went to homeless folks. And so that's 7,000 less people in the shelter system, which is great. And we have actually relatively low numbers in the shelters right now, but that's partly because people are scared to go into shelters and are, you know, doing everything they can to stay out of them. In any case, we have like 50,000 people in the shelters. So if that goes down by 7,000, that's good, but that still leaves 43,000 people who need housing they can't afford.
So when you were at the Housing Committee 2 or 3 years ago, you were, you know, I kind of sensed that your presentation was a little more action oriented, and today is a lot more data oriented. And we in our local sub-district of Dutch Kills, with about 800 beds in a 1 mile strip of from here across to 11th Street, are interested in how the city and your agency or your group, like, how can we document and publicize and successfully have more of the city evenly share the not desirable housing? You know, we don't, and I just want to say, because you're going to hear from a lot of people later, we don't feel like we're NIMBYs because we feel like we're really overburdened. And I'm not, you know what, I don't want to switch the topic right now to that. I want to stay on how you can, how we can see how the whole city can share these burdens more fairly. I think there's a fair
Which
share.
burden are you referring to?
The burden of the Lulus, of the
Dryer in the sport dryer.
I'm sorry, somebody else is talking at the same time. It's a little hard to
Yeah,
hear.
could everyone please mute themselves?
You
And,
also
and also just to say, Dom, Sam is not here to listen to everybody's complaints about what's going on. So thank you for
Right.
clarifying that. That's
Right.
not what he's here for. But your
Oh.
question is, just say it one more time so it's clear.
It's our rumor when we speak to people at the city that the less desirable land uses are being more evenly and fairly distributed throughout the city. There are some commune boards in Staten Island and in Eastern Queens that have practically no services for people experiencing homelessness. What's the city's plan to more evenly distribute these services? Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm not a representative of the city, so I can't speak on their behalf. I can say that the de Blasio administration's approach to this, I think they're, at least the way they messaged it, I can't say whether, this was true, but what they used to say was like they were concentrating shelters, especially in the neighborhoods where people last lived when they were homeless. And that was sort of how they justified a lot of this citing. I can see from your face that you're not buying it, but that's what they said. I have no idea how the Adams administration plans to do this. I can say that my focus as an advocate and the folks that I work with is to end homelessness. And the only way that we're going to do that is by producing truly affordable housing, by getting vouchers to people so that they can move out of shelters and into housing, and also by producing supportive housing, which some folks might consider a locally undesirable land use, but I really don't think we should. Supportive housing is housing for people that combines housing with social services. I live in a neighborhood that has a high amount of all of these things, of shelters as well as supportive housing. 2 doors down from me is a supportive housing place. It's really important that we have more of those and less. It's not that we need less shelters, but we need less homeless people to need shelters. I understand your argument around geographic distribution, and the honest answer is I don't know how the Adams administration is planning on dealing with that, but I can say that I am focusing on ending homelessness, which is going to also require neighborhoods taking on very low income housing in their districts. And so let's always make sure that when we talk about these things, we don't count that as a locally undesirable land.
And I just want to add that what that means in terms of us as a community board is that when we have rezonings come before us, granted, the percentage of units that are going to go towards the affordable housing, the MIH, is inadequate. And maybe that hopefully that would get changed in the future. It's only 25 to 30%, depending on which option. But it's important for us to advocate to make sure that whatever units are going to be mandated are provided, that they're as deeply affordable as possible. I think that's like really, really key, because if we're just making affordable units for people who are at 80% or 100% of the area median income, that is not going to help us get people housed who need to be housed. So I think that that's really important for us as a community board to really, stand firm on that as much as we can, even though we are just advisory. George had a question.
Madam Chair, Board Member Doreen Mohammed has her hand up.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Doreen. And then if there are any other board members, just please put your name in the chat. That's just the easiest way for me to keep track of things.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate the points made by both Sam and Evie, and just like kind of my own take that we should not be seeing and treating people, especially people who have been made homeless and stuff, as burdens. Like, it's our job to, like, we're on this community board to serve, and our job is we should be serving and centering the most vulnerable, and also to put a face to homelessness. Like, my family lost a childhood home, and I'm a former homeless survivor. So when you say things like burden, undesirable, etc., you're talking also about people like me and my family. I think just a point to humanize that. I think we have these separation distinctions that always occur, and that there needs to be less of that. So I just want to put that out there. It's not person directed at anyone, but I think that needs to be spoken of.
Thank you for sharing that, Doreen. Appreciate it. And the overwhelming majority of people who are homeless are families, right? I think that's true. And I think we should think about that as well. Okay, George, I want to, if there are no other questions from board members. Okay, Dominic, Vanessa, go ahead, Vanessa. Yeah, if you put your name in the chat, it's just easy. Sometimes I don't always see the hand depending on what your background is.
Good evening. I'm just was great information that you gave us. Thank you. And when you talk about the affordable housing and talk about with all these shelters, which a lot of the hotels are dubbing themselves as shelters, and working with all of these different variables that we have to deal with. And you talk about, and I see someone put in the chat about Rikers Island inmates and all that. The issue that we also have as far as with the homeless is that the connection with these places with the shelters, when you say about how they, that you would try to find affordable housing for them or what have you, or try to make it be where it's affordable for them to transition out, because the purpose of the shelters was supposed to be temporarily there for them to be able to transition into permanent housing, which this seems to be an impossible task, you know, because we find a lot of developers that come before the board, they don't have that in mind. None of them even think about trying to even take the risk to even cater to people like that. And I find that really to be very disappointing. And even like I live in Astoria houses and watching all this development going on up and around me and seeing the prices of what they're charging for these apartments and what, like how Evie has said before, how there's a small percentage that they do offer. And even that small percentage, that's really still not considered affordable. But then when you have it saying how you want to be fair and to everyone being able, it really is still a prejudice there. And this is something I think really needs to, like you said, hopefully the Adams administration will come along and pay attention to that. But I'd like to know what connection in your that you're trying to make as far as when you say the homeless shelters in connection to the presentation that you gave.
Yeah, well, I think the homelessness has risen so much in New York City over the past decade, and it really has, because of the housing crisis. You can find other reasons for it as well. People have mental health crises, people have addiction problems, whatever, that's all true. But a lot of people have mental health crises and addiction problems and money, and they pay and they stay in their housing. But the housing is becoming more expensive. And even though wages have actually gone up in New York City, especially because the minimum wage went up, the housing prices have gone up more. And so we've seen what we were calling before the COVID pandemic, an epidemic of evictions in New York City. As Evie said, most of New York City's homeless are families. They are all formerly housed, right? Everybody who becomes homeless was housed at some point. And we slowed that through a few things, through the right to counsel program, which gave lawyers to low-income tenants who were facing eviction, through the changes to the rent laws, but we still see it happening. And now the fastest group of people becoming homeless are single adults. In terms of getting folks out of shelter and into homelessness, the right to shelter is really important. It was a hard-fought right, and we have it. But yes, it's supposed to be a short-term emergency situation, and then you get into housing. There's two problems. One is we don't have enough affordable housing being produced that's actually affordable to people who are in the shelter system. Instead, we have affordable housing that's being produced for people who make, you know, money, but not quite enough money to live in the nicest housing. The second problem is discrimination on the part of landlords who won't accept vouchers. Vouchers can come in the form of those Section 8 vouchers I was talking about before, but we also have city-based vouchers and state-based vouchers, which are usually called FEPS vouchers. Landlords are legally barred from discriminating based on source of income. It shouldn't matter whether the money is coming straight out of my pocket or whether I'm paying a third of my income and the government is paying the difference between that and what the landlord charges. All the money is supposed to get to the landlord and they're not supposed to discriminate, but we know that it happens. So we have to kind of attack both problems. We need to produce housing that's actually affordable to the population that's finding themselves living for years in homeless shelters. Nobody wants that. And we need to stop discrimination to make sure that people can move into what is often very nice housing and the landlord gets the full rent. It's just covered by a combination of the tenant and the public.
Exactly, because I want to see that. I really would love to see that change because I know quite a few people personally that I know, and even people that I've met who has these vouchers, but is having such a difficult time finding someone to accept them. And that is so unfair. And then they're not looking at the fact that these are people who want to have a quality living like anyone else. It's just that they are receiving assistance to do so, not for them to be looked upon as that they are less than or worse off for them to take that risk. And that's what is a problem I'm finding, especially in the Astoria and Long Island City area, across New York City, period. But if we can find all these places that they can go and build up over on, and the city is letting all of this happen, there's no way you cannot say we can solve this homeless issue, and especially these families who are holding on to these vouchers. You got a lot of families that's in the shelters that's holding on to these vouchers. And they're sitting there, and I know families who's been in these shelters for quite a few years, 6, 7, 8 years in a shelter because they can't find anyone who's willing to take them and their family. And a lot of these developers are not even dedicating themselves to family-oriented households. They want to do something more, less desirable because they feel that that is not something that's more up their alley. And we're losing the dynamics of families in our community. And that's what's sad about this whole situation. And I pray one day that soon that this all will change. Thank you for your presentation and your explanation.
And if I can make one more follow-up, which is just to say that we're talking about voucher holders as people getting public assistance. And that's true, that's literally what it is. But we should remember that the single largest recipient of public housing funding, housing from the federal government, are homeowners getting the mortgage interest tax deduction, which is the largest federal housing program in the country. And in New York City, it's developers getting 421A. We pay more to developers getting 421A than any other single housing subsidy, be that vouchers, public housing, subsidized housing. We're releasing our next report is on 421A, and we'll be making that case.
Thank you. Sorry, I lost my connection while just after Vanessa asked her question. So I missed a chunk right there. I apologize for that. I had to reboot my computer. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, Dominic, we'll go back to you. And then I actually have a follow-up question.
I have a question, Evie.
As well. Okay,
Evie,
Katie.
I don't need to
One
say
sec.
it, but I just put it in the chat if you want to ask after Dominic.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Go ahead,
Sam,
Dominic.
Sam, I know that San Jose, California, Minneapolis, Portland, Oregon, all these cities have done a really progressive modification to their single family zoning areas. And you kind of almost repelled your conversation from the outer extremities of our, when you were looking at Queens there, you kind of gave Eastern Queens a pass. You kind of gave, I think that this idea of converting single family homes to optional 2-family homes will bring 90 to 100,000 potential units to the city. And like I say, it is happening. California just made a statewide change to single family zoning. And, like every time we sit in the housing committee and we hear people argue about 16 units or 14 units, at the end of the year, you might have, 400 versus 600 units. It's pissing into the wind. So when in terms of actions, will this city modify the single family zone? Randy, do you know that it's been built on systemic racism over the last century?
Yeah, now I'm remembering we had that conversation 2 or 3 years ago. I'm not giving Eastern Queens a pass at all. What I'm saying is that the city gave them a pass. The city placed less affordable housing in Queens by proportion than in the rest of the city, and far less in Staten Island. Right. In terms of the neighborhoods that were rezoned, it tended to be places that were already moderately dense, rather than places that were very low density. I see no reason for there to be mandatory single family housing in a city like New York City. Even if you rezoned to say there's no more single family districts, that doesn't even mean that, somebody can still keep their single family home if they want, but if they wanted to, they could add a second unit. There's no reason, no legitimate reason not to do that. I would fully support it. So yeah, I'm not giving a pass to exclusionary homeowner neighborhoods. I think that the problem has been that we've concentrated new development in the places where the political constituency needed something else from the city, and they could trade away the rezoning to get it. And that's why the poorest neighborhoods have tended to be the ones that have gotten the most intensive rezonings, both under de Blasio and under Bloomberg.
Katie, go ahead with your question, and then I'll ask my follow-up to Sam.
Thank you. I just wanted to know how come in the MIH, there isn't a percentage set aside for Section 8? And how come it's just not mandatory with all of these developments that a certain percentage just be designated for people that get Section 8 vouchers? So there wouldn't be any discriminatory practices in regards to excluding them from, new housing.
I think it's a good question. I'll say a couple of things. The first is that discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders is legally barred anyway. So there shouldn't be discrimination against them anywhere. And not just Section 8 vouchers, also city FEPS vouchers, state FEPS vouchers, all the vouchers. And we need more enforcement of those anti-discrimination suits. But you could say a certain percentage of the new housing is for extremely low incomes, and they can be paid for by vouchers. Late in his administration, in his second term, the mayor agreed to set aside 15% of city subsidized units for homeless households. He should have done that on day one. And we would have had more housing that people could move out of shelters and into in that way. So I think in terms of a set aside that's specifically for homeless households, absolutely. And a voucher is a perfectly good way to ensure that whether their income goes up or down, the costs of maintaining the housing are supported. I think we probably need more vouchers, especially from the federal government, to actually be able to maintain, let's say a 15% standard in all new buildings. If we had that though, then I could see that going forward. There's a push right now in Albany for something called the Housing Access Voucher Program, which would be like Section 8, but created by New York State. New York State basically saying, the federal government has abdicated its responsibility. We're going to step in and we're going to create a voucher that looks exactly like Section 8. And therefore all the operators know how to use it, only we're going to create it and fund it ourselves. So that's called the Housing Access Voucher Program. Legislation is, I forget the numbers, but it's Kavanaugh in the Senate and Simberwitz in the Assembly. And the coalitions that I'm a part of have been pushing for it for a number of years. And it looks like this could be the year when it passes.
That's great. Thank you. I want to go back to MIH because I think there was a question in the chat. I don't know if it was answered by George, but basically what's the AMI? What's the area median income? He asked for CB1 Queens. I know for the city, it's about 101,000. I'd have to look it up, but could you had also said something about the fact that, right now when AMI is calculated for the mandatory inclusionary housing units, it's figures that come from HUD, correct? From the federal government, and it includes Westchester, it includes the Upper East Side, it includes all these other areas that are much more wealthy than, many parts of the city. And you had said something, Sam, in the presentation, okay, well, the city could maybe, if they revised mandatory inclusionary housing, to use AMI kind of focused on, that community that it's situated in. Is that actually something that could be done through legislation? That's the first time I've actually heard of that. I know people have talked about it on the state level, but that's the first time that I've heard anyone mention it actually being able to be done by the city itself. So just curious to hear more about that.
Yeah. So like you said, area median income as a statistic is calculated by the federal government, by HUD. And it is based on all of New York City, plus Rockland, Putnam, and Westchester counties. And so the inclusion of Westchester, Rockland, and Putnam drives it up over New York City's, but also, like you're saying, it's also citywide. So including, the Upper East Side and Billionaires Row will also drive it up in relation to a lot of the neighborhoods of New York City. And then I said also in the presentation that that's not enough. They actually then take that and add an extra % to account for high construction costs in New York City. So it is a juice statistic in terms of the median income for New York City, not to mention the median income for your community district. I actually don't know what the median income in your district is, though I could find out. But the federal government doesn't calculate an area median income for Community Board 1 Queens. They only calculate it for the entire metropolitan area of New York City, which they define as the 5 boroughs, Putnam, Rockland, and Westchester. In terms of what we do about that, there is an argument that Congress should pass a law mandating that area median income be more geographically restricted, so that maybe it's just New York City, maybe it's by county, maybe it's by zip code. It's 100 different ways you could do it. That's fine with me, but I actually think it's a bit of a diversion from the problem. If the problem is we're producing housing that's not affordable to the people who need it or the people in a particular community, we can adjust that by saying what % of the AMI are we developing for, right? It's a numerator and a denominator. If AMI is too high, then you go for a lower % of the AMI and you come out with the same thing. So what I was saying about what the city could do is the city could, rather than have one term sheet for the entire city, have some sort of a relative term sheet where this type of housing will be funded to make housing that is locally affordable at the 50th percentile, or housing that is locally affordable at the 40th percentile or at the 60th percentile. And you could then figure out what the AMI level would be from that. It's not a problem we can't get around. It is a problem we can't fix. So we can't fix it at the city level, but it almost doesn't matter. All we need is housing that is appropriate, and we can make housing that is targeted at a lower % of AMI and have exactly that same result.
So again, that's just really making sure we advocate as a community board in the ULURP process, but then also we need to make sure that our city council member who, has the most influence in terms of what actually gets passed in terms of any zoning changes.
Yeah, and away from zoning, also advocate to the mayor too, because HPD, which is a mayoral agency, is the one that comes up with the term sheets for new city subsidized developments in the city. And that a term sheet is sort of like how the deal gets done. And they come up with 5 or 6 standard term sheets that they use for city development over the course of their administration. So it's also up to the Adams administration to decide if they want to sort of do things like they have been before or find a new way forward.
Thank you. Thanks, Mitch, for dropping those statistics in. I'm not sure where you got them, but we appreciate it. That seems
that's according to 2020 census, and it's censusreporter.org.
And that's for Astoria, that's
literally defined as CB1.
Yeah, okay, great.
5.2 miles, and that's also our population number in terms of density.
Great.
Evie, as long as I'm talking, can I ask a question?
Yes, you can.
Sam, one of the concerns that I often bring up in community board meetings is the concept of municipal carrying capacity versus the actual requirements of the New York City Charter for city services that are provided to a population within a given neighborhood. For instance, for every 10,000 people, you're supposed to have a square acre of parkland. You're supposed to have XYZ number of hospital beds, transit capacity, school desks, NYPD officers, FDNY coverage, DSNY employees, and so on. And it's something that I have seen as Western Queens has become more dense between the build out in CB2, Long Island City, and Astoria. has become a paucity of city services and a scarcity of city services. I'm wondering if during the planning that you and your colleagues make as far as ending homelessness and creating these new supportive apartments, if those sort of topics come up.
Yeah, but I should be clear, I'm not a planner for the city.
I understand, but you're an intellectual wrestling with difficult topics. So as a citizen and as a community board member, I would say that this is definitely a concern of those of us who are lucky enough to be housed. And the question that I have as we continue to build out the population, I mean, I don't have to bring up the last 2 years and the subject of ICU beds in New York City. So the question is this something that, as you know, you're formulating your recommendations, if this is something that comes up during the conversation? Thank you.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I am trained in urban planning. And one of the things that you learn when you're trained in urban planning and then go into practice in New York City is that we don't plan much, that much of the planning is incredibly distributed. In agencies, geographically distributed, and it doesn't come together very well. So for example, we know that we are at risk of flooding as sea levels rise. We have about 14 different plans to deal with it. Some of them are contradictory. They have different agencies working at different scales. We've got, you know, buying people out of their homes in Western Staten Island as we're moving more people to other parts of the waterfront. It's pretty incoherent. There was a proposal put forward by Corey Johnson this past year for what he called a comprehensive planning framework, which I think was an idea that needed some work, but was an interesting one and probably the direction that I would advocate for as a city. And it did a few things that are important. One is it would connect the city's needs assessment to the budget process and to the land use process. Right now, those three things tend to happen parallel and separate, and they really should be connected. When you do that, you can then say, where do we have too much of a certain thing? Where do we have too little of it? Where are we raising funds and where are we spending them? And what can we do about it? You know, do we need to raise more tax dollars to do what we need? Are we misallocating our tax dollars towards one area and not another? Are we putting some people at risk of flood and others are safe, and therefore we should be building in the safe areas and not the flood prone areas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if we're going to deal with the kinds of mismatch between needs and services in the city, we're going to have to do it at a citywide scale. And that can be daunting for a city as large as ours. But I think we've found that the kind of neighborhood by neighborhood approach tends to reinforce a lot of inequalities, where certain neighborhoods get underserved and other neighborhoods, I don't want to say get overserved, but get the kind of services that everyone really deserves.
Thank you. Okay, there's two questions there. Well, one is, you know, someone asked about Section 9. Is it a voucher program? Section 9 is public housing, right? So NYCHA, think of NYCHA. Public housing is Section 9. So hopefully, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, Sam, but someone just was curious about that. There is, we could kind of get into, you know, it's maybe at another meeting talking about just certain threats to public housing, or just also some programs that have been pushed in public housing, RAD. I don't know if you've heard of that, and also something called the Blueprint. I don't think we really have time for that now, but Section 9 is public housing, kind of has how we've known it. The other question was, and I don't really know if you can, this is so granular, Sam, but I think it kind of speaks to the issue of the fact that we know that there's such a need for affordable housing. So like, why do things like hotels keep getting built? You know, why do that's what has happened in Dutch Kills, and a lot of those you know, hotels have been converted to temporary shelters right now, and some permanent shelters. You know, why is so much market rate housing, you know, or luxury housing being built when we know that the need is affordable housing? I mean, that is like, you know, of course the big question, but that is like someone is asking that question because, you know, we love New York City, right? We want it to be a place that everybody can live, just like we were able to, come and live here, or if we grew up here, and we want to make sure that it stays a place where anyone can kind of, build their life. But I don't know why, like, you wrote a book called, I'm going to plug Sam's book because it's really great, actually. It's called well, you say what your book is, Sam. I'll let you plug it. It's fantastic. It's all about the real estate industry.
Thanks. Yeah, my book is called Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate State. And it's about how the real estate industry and the urban planning systems have merged in New York and many other places. In terms of why are those things being built, I mean, the simplest answer is because they can, but it's a slightly different answer for the hotels than the unaffordable housing. On the hotel front, part of the issue is land use and zoning. A lot of hotels are built in manufacturing districts. There's not a lot of new manufacturing that's being built, though there is a lot of interesting manufacturing activity happening in places like the Marine Park terminal in Brooklyn and some others. But on the whole, in those manufacturing districts, the new things that are being built as of right without a zoning change tend to be hotels. The reason that hotels are allowed in manufacturing areas is that the theory was, well, maybe it's dangerous to be exposed to those things or annoying to be exposed to the things that factories belch out. But if you're only there for a short-term stay, it's not really that dangerous to you. So we can put a hotel in the manufacturing district, but we don't want residential. Those hotels, however, are able to become shelters and get around the zoning, which I know that there are some neighbors who don't like that, but I want to say that from the residents' perspective, that's really bad and really dangerous too. If those areas were determined to be unsafe for long-term habitation and people are not in shelters for just short-term emergency stays, but for a way too long a time because of what I talked about before, the lack of affordable housing and discrimination, then people are living in unsafe conditions as well. In terms of why is so much unaffordable housing being produced, I'd say there's two related answers to that. One is the developers think that they can fill them with higher income tenants. And then relatedly, they often can fill them with higher income tenants. There is still a demand for high-end housing in New York City. If you look at some of the charts of economic activity in the region, you see that there's far more job production in New York City than in the surrounding areas. There's a lot of severely economically devastated areas of our region, and yet New York City is booming. Even, right now is pretty bad conditions because of COVID, but in general, job rates are growing here. And so there are higher income people moving to the city and looking for housing, and developers think they can get away with it. And often enough they can, and sometimes they can't. And then they can either bring the rents down or try to find a tenant who will pay with a voucher. That's a relatively good outcome from our perspective. This is why we need, a more active intervention, because the market is not going to solve this problem on its own. The developers are always looking for the highest payer, and it would take a very long time for the city to produce way too many of those very high-end apartments to the extent that they actually filter down in the market. The classic studies that argue for that tend to say that it takes about 30 years. That's 30 years more of an affordable housing crisis. And so while there might be some areas that stand to have more market rate housing that have just, have no housing production in them right now, there are a lot of other places that need all sorts of affordable housing instead, and they don't get it because the market doesn't incentivize it. So we need to reorient our planning to change those incentives and to do more with publicly owned land and public subsidy. In terms of the hotels, I mean, those have been built now. And so I think the best thing to do is to convert them into permanently affordable housing. And I worked on a piece of legislation called the Housing Our Neighbors with Dignity Act last year, which provides funding to do that. It hasn't actually been done. And we have to look more at why that isn't happening. I think part of it has to do with zoning and building code issues. Part of it has to do with the developers holding on to the properties and thinking that somebody will come along and pay more for it. But something has to be done with those hotels that have been built out. And I think we can also change the land use laws to keep those hotels out. In fact, the de Blasio administration did actually pass a citywide rezoning that says that new hotels in the future need city approval to go through, which is probably going to drastically reduce the number of new manufacturing district hotels that get put up in neighborhoods around the city.
Thank you, Sam. I know that there are some folks from the public who've joined this meeting who, we're learning about the Honda program. And I think, one of the things that you emphasized, and is that it is permanent, it's permanently affordable housing. I don't know if people, would you be willing to take a couple questions on it if people had it on the legislation?
Sure. And I can say out front, just to dispel a myth, it is not shelters. It is permanently affordable housing. Correct. With quality standards written into it, rent stabilized, half for formerly homeless households, half for just tenants who need housing. That's the model in the legislation.
Thank you. Thanks. Does anyone have a question? And right now, I think there's really not any substantial funding in place for it either, unfortunately. But
there's $100 million in the budget with which not a single developer has been able to access.
And that's for New York State or New York City?
It's actually just for New York City. Next year, it'll open up to New York State, but New York City had the first bite at it. And it can only be nonprofit developers who build the housing.
Okay, questions. Who would the Honda housing be for? I mean, I don't know why people, okay. One of the questions, would it be for families and for inmates, Honda for all? Well, everyone deserves a home if they have done their time. But anyway, Sam, who is the housing for? I think you did mention it, right? 50%?
50% for people who are currently homeless and exiting the shelter system, 50% for just tenants who need new housing. Of course, it's not for inmates. Inmates don't live in the general population. If people are released and they don't have housing, they will just end up in the shelter system. And then there was another question, is it in Manhattan? Yes, it's statewide. There is no restricted area.
Any other questions on the legislation? No? Okay, all right, well, it's almost 8 o'clock. The other thing that I wanted to mention, just for people to be aware of, is that, as you know, due to COVID, there has been an eviction moratorium in place. It's set to expire on January 15th. It's unclear now whether that will be extended, but that's just something to be aware of and also let people know about. I do believe that the application for assistance, if you need rental assistance, has been reopened. It was closed in November, and I think just last week, I can't remember, the 7th, maybe Friday or Saturday, it was reopened. It's announced that it's going to be reopened, so that if someone has not been able to pay their rent, that they are able to apply for rental assistance. I don't know if you have any more information on that, Sam, but I just wanted to make sure people were aware of that.
Yeah, a court ordered that it was illegal for the state to close the application process on Friday. I think they had until Tuesday to reopen it. I don't know if they actually have yet. The other thing that's important to say is by signing up for emergency rental assistance, you also, you cannot be evicted while the state is reviewing your evaluation. So it's really important that folks apply if they were unable to pay rent at some point during the pandemic. That is what the program is for, and it will protect you.
There's also legislation that's being proposed on the state level. James just kind of dropped it in the chat. It's called Good Cause. So it's basically to ensure that as many people as possible are able to stay in their homes, and there has to be reasonable good cause for eviction. If you'd like to learn more about that, you could join that town hall tomorrow. I don't know if you want to add to that, Sam. You are the housing expert. I am not. So if you want to,
it's a very important bill, and especially if they're going to end the eviction moratorium, it's very important. It would end no-fault evictions in almost all cases, which is to say that people should be given a right to renew their lease. And if they're not paying, if they're a nuisance, for other reasons, they can of course be evicted, but nobody can be evicted simply because the owner of the property wants to replace them with someone who will pay exorbitantly more.
And there, like New Jersey has had good cause eviction for years now, I think, right? There are other states who, and also some cities as well, that have good cause.
Yes, several cities upstate have passed it. New Jersey has had it for almost 50 years. California passed a version of it recently as well.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Comments? Anything else that anyone on the board wants to bring up, or anyone in the public that hasn't been brought up? Okay, I really want to thank you, Sam, for giving us your time. And I really encourage folks to, to read the report. I think it's really, and check out that tool and just kind of learn more. And then also like really advocate to make sure that there is more affordable housing for people so that we don't have such a problem with homelessness. It's really at kind of epic proportions here in New York City. And, we want to make sure that folks have permanent homes. And, everyone deserves that, at least in my opinion. So making sure that we advocate for that and advocate for the services that people need as well within the shelter system, I think is critical. So that people aren't left kind of, out, they're not left out to dry. Okay, so I guess if there's nothing else, no new business, old business? No? Okay. All right, well, with that, it is 7:58. I am going to ask for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all. Listen, have a happy, safe, healthy new year. And our next housing meeting will be in March. If you have something that you would like to be discussed or for us to bring in a speaker, please let me know or let Florence know and we'll arrange for that. But Sam, I want to thank you again. Really appreciate you and all the work that you're doing and the fact that you're kind of, sharing your expertise with us on the community board level. Thank you. Really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, and I just wanted to maybe introduce really quick Farah. Farah, do you want to say hello?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Farah. This is one of my first Community Board 1 meetings. I'm from Councilmember Julie Wan's office. I'm the district manager, so I'll be attending these meetings, or another staff member will attend these meetings, just so that way we can learn information like we did today with Sam, or bring information as well. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here. And if you have any questions or anything, you can always contact us. We just got our I just got my city council email today. So I'll put in my contact info here. And you can always contact us at our district email as well.
Congratulations on your new role, Farah. We look forward to working with you and Councilmember Julie Wan. So yeah, excited to see you here. Thank you for attending as well.
Yes, I'm putting my information in the chat right now.
Great.
So.
All right, and thank you folks from Dutch Kills. Appreciate you coming out tonight. And with that, we'll adjourn them, make sure that everyone can get Farah's information if they need it. Julie represents Dutch Kills. That is within her district, Julie Wan. So if you would like to, share your thoughts and opinions on what's going on there, you can definitely reach out as well.
I definitely learned a lot today. Yeah, and if you all have any thoughts, questions, concerns, comments, please feel free to share with our emails, the council member, and I'll make sure that it gets to the council member.
Yeah, and Dutch Kill Civic Association does meet monthly, I think, right? You're back to meeting monthly, George, or no? Yes?
Yeah, I'm actually was connecting with George earlier or later last week and earlier today as well.
Okay, great. So hopefully, the council member can go to one of the meetings too, and
yes, they're scheduling them to come to our February 10th meeting.
Fabulous.
So
Fabulous.
it's a great
Great.
connection. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. I guess with that, we'll adjourn the meeting. So thank you again. Take care.
Take care.
Florence. Hi, Florence. I'm Nida.
Shahana's has a question before you close, Evie. I know
Oh,
you're
sorry.
closing the meeting.
Yeah.
It's okay. I want to share with all of you tomorrow and the Ravenswood Community Center from 9 to 1. No, not tomorrow. Sorry, Wednesday. We're going to have the RV for the people to do the test and everything. From 9
Oh.
to 1. And
COVID testing.
in the community, Ravenswood Community Center.
Oh, that's great. Tomorrow, just tomorrow?
Not tomorrow, sorry, not tomorrow.
Wednesday.
It's Wednesday.
Wednesday. Okay, great.
Yes.
Maybe Florence, you could tweet it out or something. That would be great. So people
Yeah,
know.
for the Ravenswood and everyone in the community, if anyone want to do it, we're going to have the RV.
Shahana's email me the information and I'll put it on Twitter and Facebook if you want me to.
Okay, and I see Faraz from the Council City. If you have a telephone number for the office, please, if you can share it also.
I can share the telephone number. Shahnas, can you send me information on the Ravenswood vaccine van? That way we can also share out with our, community members. And I'll have the number to you in a moment.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you.
Not a problem.
And Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year's. I'll also
Thank you.
send some information of the one that we're also doing for the vaccine and the booster, as well as the flu. That's going to be on the 25th in Astoria, Hannock Community Center, and in Ravenswood as well on the 26th of January. So I'll send that off to all of you as well.
Thanks so much.
Vanessa, could you send that to me as well?
Send it to the court office and we'll send it out to everybody.
Awesome. Thank you.
Definitely.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, sometimes when the hand, like your background has beautiful colored leaves, it kind of just blended in. I didn't see it. So sorry about that.
That's okay. I understand. Thanks so
All
much.
right.
Have a good night, everyone.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Good night.
You
Thanks
too.
again. Thanks, Florence.
Good. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you, Florence. Thank you, everybody.